It's a great pleasure being here. I'd like to thank Jenny and the rest of the pedal group for inviting me. It was a wonderful invitation. As David said, we spent a few days in Tuscany getting ready for the meeting. So I'm going to be talking about object play. Object use and object play is an example of what I think needs to be done more of in play research, and that is have very clear definitions of what it is we mean by play. As Jenny talked about earlier, definitions of play are really problematical. It's a very slippery construct to define, and one of the reasons that we have people having a negative or equivocal view of play is the definitions are all over the place. Some people don't define it at all. Some people define it as a combination of games, just regular social interaction, as well as play. Other people are very strict about how they define it. So in order, certainly for science to advance, we have to be on the same page. And what's happening now, in addition, we have a proliferation of new definitions of play, things like exploratory play, where it's very clear, exploration's one construct, according to me anyway, and play's another construct, and things like instructional play or structured play, which in many ways seems to me an oxymoron, but we'll get there. So play's controversial. Some people see it has great benefits, and it is a very important thing to study. E.O. Wilson, Bertrand Russell, Pat Bateson, two famous Cambridge types, Piaget, Brunner, Vygotsky. On the negative to equivocal side, you have actually another Cambridge group here, Tim Clutton-Brock, Paul Martin, Tim Cairo. It's not so important. Problems, again, are based on vague definitions and generally overblown claims. In other words, saying play does X, Y, and Z, when in fact a lot of those results don't replicate. So I'm going to be using object use, and specifically within that object play as a way of dealing with definitions, and I'm going to be trying to make some inferences about function, and the functions that I'm going to be making inferences about are related to social behavior, social dominance, social status. Object use, object play is central in especially cognitive developmental theory. It was the basis of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Of course, his idea of sensory motor intelligence is based on object use in infancy. And these same theories and same concepts have been applied to primate cognition as well. In developmental psychology, and this also builds on what Jenny said earlier, developmental psychology tends to be deductive. That is, we tend to have these a priori hypotheses and then test them. The scientific method, as again, like Jenny said, involves scaling and rescaling, going up and down the ladder of induction and deduction. You start off by making inductions. That is, in this case, you inductively define what a category is. Based on that inductive category, you test hypotheses. In developmental psychology, again, we have these a priori definitions based on what people think it is. And they're generally subsumed under labels like object play and construction, but it's very loosely used, as I'll show you. In 1972, Nick Burton-Jones edited a wonderful book called Ethological Studies in Children's Behavior. And it was a group of ethologists and a few psychologists using ethological methods in inducing categories to study kids' behavior and studying kids' play. Much of what child psychology knows about object use and object play is based on the work of the Israeli psychologist Sarah Smolansky, who based her categorization of kids' play, she said, on Piaget's theory, And she had this category called constructive play. In fact, Piaget was very explicit. Funny thing, the construction was not play, because construction is more accommodative, where play is more assimilative. You know, the famous, a friend of mine once said, the Batman and Robin of Piagetian theory was assimilation and accommodation. Play is much more assimilative, construction is accommodative. Construction is generally an ends-oriented enterprise where something is being built. So I'm going to define different forms of object use. I'm going to be talking about exploration, construction, play, tool use, tool making in childhood. I'm going to talk about time budgets for each of these. My orientation is a behaviorally ecological orientation, the assumption being there's a correspondence between the amount of resources that an individual expends in a behavior, whether it be time, whether it be energy, or avoiding danger. So there should be a correspondence between investment in that behavior and a payoff. And I'm going to be talking about the social consequences, social context in which each of these things develop, and I'm going to be making inferences. And the inferences that I'm going to end up making are related to creativity. I think from my mind, my bias is the smartest people who've studied play all seem to think that it's got something to do with creativity. People like Pat Bateson, people like Jerry Bruner, people like Bob Fagan, creativity, because as we're going to talk about it, play isn't ends-oriented. Kids they're creative. They do very, very diverse sorts of behaviors. So it's creativity and then social status associated with that creativity. Social dominance, social status associated with the creativity that kids show with objects. Exploration, it's exhibited by certainly most, if not all, mammals. It's what individuals do when they first encounter a new object. So you first encounter this thing here, you've never seen anything like this, so what you do is you explore it. You look at its, you look at its color, its shape, the noise it makes. You may taste it if you're of that ilk. But before you can play with something, you have to explore it, because play with objects is based on the attributions of the object. And within species development, ontogeny, exploration precedes play. Okay, the people who've done the best work in this, actually Corin Hutt, who I think it was the University of Hull many years ago, did some of the best work in the field, and Jay Belsky early on did very nice work with infants. The behavioral attributes, very reliable to measure. Animal people study this all the time. Flat affect, intent, not distractible. So if you look at kids' gaze, they're in the zone, increased heart rate. They're excited because they're intent. Kid in our neighborhood that our daughter used to take care of, he was exploring things. Intent. Okay, if you look at infants, they explore toys during the first year of life. This is Belsky's research from 7.5 to 10.5 months, basically exploration. No instances of pretend play with objects. Okay, then pretend play started co-occurring with exploration. Preschool age, you don't get much of it. This research that I'm going to be citing here is based on research with two of my former graduate students, and it was all done at the University of Minnesota, the Shirley Moore Nursery School at the Institute for Child Development, the University of Minnesota. So they're university lab kids, given all the limitations of university lab kids. We know a lot about university lab kids in the lab, very little about kids, other kinds of kids, but Exploration spikes when kids are exposed to new objects. So if you look in most preschools, you don't get much exploration. And it doesn't vary with age. When you do get spikes in exploration is if there's been a holiday break, for example. So kids come back from Christmas holiday. Typically, teachers put new objects in the classroom, exploration spikes. Kids get to know the objects, it goes away, basically. If we have time at the end, it's very important to talk about the difference between exploration and play for assessment of kids. If I don't talk about it, if you're interested, ask me to talk about it. Sex differences, boys more than girls. Social context. Generally, adults facilitate infants' exploration. So whether they are either just present or coach them, they're more exploratory. Certainly in preschool, Bruce Henderson's another University of Minnesota study, same finding. In the studies that we did at the University of Minnesota looking at exploration, it tended to be solitary. And it doesn't attract peers' attention. It's called attention structure. And the way you measure attention structure is the number of people looking at someone. So I'm looking at Jenny. A number of you are probably looking at Jenny now because I'm looking at Jenny. So we count the number of people looking at our focal child, and that's a measure of social dominance, social status. It's used it's a reliable measure of dominance or status. Certainly it's been used with monkeys, with chimpanzees, and with preschool kids. It does not, kids exploring objects does not attract social attention. Object play. My definition of play, and we could talk about this later if you're interested. There's a debate, generally in classification, generally, but certainly in play research. There's a debate whether you should define play continuously or categorically. Continuous definitions, Ken Rubin advocated, you could define it as more or less play. A behavior could be more or less playful. Categorical play, it's either play or not play. My colleague, friend Gordon Burghardt, I take his point of view, it's either play or not play. And we could, if you want to talk about that later, we can, because it's interesting discussion. Play, by definition, has to be voluntary. You can't say, okay, kid, you must play now. You know, that's not to say that telling kids to do something is bad. I'm saying if we want to meet this definition. It's not immediately functional. It's not functional in its immediate context. So a kid pretending to drink tea, it looks functional, but it's not functional because they're not drinking. Means over ends. Kids are much more concerned with the process rather than the end product. So if you look at if you look at many preschool kids playing with blocks, they start off building a castle. The castle becomes a rocket. The rocket becomes a boat. The boat becomes, etc. So they're not concerned with the end product much. Elements are exaggerated, segmented, and non-sequential. So they take these behavioral routines from everyday life, but they throw them up in the air. Thus their creativity. They throw them up in the air and reorder them. Brunner, I once heard someone call him the prescient one. Indeed, he was a very prescient guy. He came up with this concept of behavioral modules. But it's not like the modules that evolutionary psychologists use. It's these idea of creative individual action units associated with play. Behavioral attributes relative to exploration of object play. Kids are positive. Animal people call it a play face. You know, dogs can recognize another dog being playful. A chimpanzee, they can recognize it very reliably. They're distractible when they're playing, and they have a lower heart rate. Again, this is all Corin Hutz stuff here. Here's the same guy, Finn. Positive affect. Remember him with this. Time budget. It's difficult to document. It's difficult to document because people have used Smolansky's measure of play generally, of object play, and its construction. And you'll see that when you use that, the percentages are 40 or 50% of kids' behavior, where if you take a narrower view, it's much less. So it's been conflated with other forms of object use. According to Belsky, it begins about a year of age, increases 3 to 5 years of age. Studies done, again, these are studies I did. And I don't know if you know this work. Bill McGrew, British guy, did these studies. He's a primatologist, actually. But he did these studies at the University of Stirling in the late 60s and early 70s on preschool kids using his ethological methods to study kids' social behavior and kids' play. So, you know, people like Bill McGrew did it, Peter Smith did it. Same sort of findings is what we found. A hallmark of play behavior. So different forms, you know, I gave you a general definition of play, but generally we have object play, social play, locomotor play, and fantasy play. All forms of play, using the definition that I use, follow an inverted U function. By that I mean it starts off relatively infrequent very early in childhood and infancy, peaks sometime in late preschool, early primary school, and then declines again. All inverted U curve. Sex differences, equivocal. Growth curve modeling, I'll show you in the second study that we did, we had over 90 kids, observed them for over a year, good sample, reliable, you know, we observed them once a week. And my student was a statistical whiz. She did these growth curve models, no sex differences. Social context, like other forms of pretend, becomes more social with age. Okay? Construction. Again, most of what we know about it is based on Smolansky. Piaget and others, Peter Smith, did not consider construction play. I don't know if you know this paper that Peter Smith wrote in 1986. It's called The Play Ethos. It's wonderful. It's the idea that we, you know, as scientists, we have to remain skeptical about the data, and the study of play people tend to be overly optimistic about its effects. So we're not objective enough. I'm not trying to be Scrooge here. I'm just trying to have an objective look at this. Again, it's more, construction's more accommodative, play is more assimilative. And, you know, if you don't believe Peter's distinction or Piaget's distinction, if you look at construction across the preschool period, it's flat. It doesn't follow the typical inverted U function of play. And there's other sort of convergent, divergent validity data that I'll show you that show that construction's not play. Okay? There's Finn and his brother Wyatt. Okay, so construction could be, again, a constellation of goal-directed behavior. For example, if you read the fine print of examples in a lot of these studies, you could use blocks to build steps, and it's coded constructive play. That could be coded as tool use. Okay. So the descriptive data for that Smolansky provides are valuable to the extent that it gives you a general idea of object use, but it's not play. You know, she provided a service by giving us all this descriptive data, but a disservice to the extent that she called it play. Ken Rubin used this system a lot in studying kids' play behavior, and he found that what he called constructive play, which is basically what Smolansky called constructive play, accounted for between 40 and 51% of preschool kids' behavior. This is in the university lab schools. This was outside of Toronto, Canada. Construction, as I defined it, 7% of kids' behavior. I think the reason is Rubin considered all forms of object use in preschool other than pretend constructive play. Okay, that's basically that. Again, no change, reinforcing the idea that construction's not play. Sex difference, females greater than males, we found the same thing. This was Rubin's matrix, by the way, if you're not familiar with it. It's very useful. It's actually very useful for preschool teachers to code kids' behavior. So, you know, this was Parton's famous social continuum, solitary parallel social, though she had both cooperative and associative, but that's basically social. And then these were basically Piaget's categories. Okay, solitary construction for Rubin, 8 to 9%. Group, which was the sum of parallel, associative, and cooperative, between 33 and 37. Okay, tool use. Oh, I didn't turn my timer on. How am I doing for time?
15 minutes.
Oh, good, okay. So tool use is an individual using an object not attached to their body or the environment in the service of a goal. So using a stick to get something, using a screwdriver would be tool use. Using a fingernail to twist a screw would not be tool use because it's connected to your body. Tool making is something more complicated, as we'll see. And it's using, for example, a pipe cleaner or a coat hanger to retrieve something that you can't reach. Okay, so tool use is rather convergent. You're using something according to a cultural convention, such as using a fork. Tool making is much more creative. Individuals have to solve a problem and figure out affordances of objects around them that will help them solve that problem. As we'll see later, reliably, kids do not make tools to solve problems until middle childhood. Okay, so again, tool use appears relatively early in ontogeny, increasing through childhood. The papers here by Kevin Conley, formerly of Sheffield, was babies using forks. And you know, you've all seen babies trying to use forks. And that's a very good example of early object use and how adults can facilitate it, but they start using them pretty early in time. We have virtually no data, to my knowledge anyway. Some anthropologists have some data on this, on everyday uses of tools in kids. We have 3 studies that I know of anyway, in the 2 in university lab schools, and John Bach, who's an anthropologist at somewhere, Cal State somewhere, observing Botswana preschool kids. And we basically have very similar findings because we have similar definitions. We found University of Minnesota kids, between 19 and 23% of their time is in tool use. John's Botswana, they're pastoral people. So not hunter-gatherers, but early farm, you know, farming and herding. About 17%. So pretty close. no sex differences. Where you get sex differences in tool use is if you look within categories of tool use, such as using a bow and arrow, guess the sex difference, such as using cooking implements. Foraging, Amazonia. Boys more than girls use bows and arrows, duh. Girls more than boys use tools relating to gathering. And here's some of Amazonian pictures of kids, bows and arrows, making baskets, making tools, much more complicated. Kids don't really get it until middle childhood. Again, you have to identify a goal, the accordances of the objects, physically use that object to get it done. And it requires a fair amount of behavioral flexibility. Social facilitation. With infants, if an adult models the use of a tool, infants will be able to do it. Left on their own, they can't figure out how to use those same materials to solve the problem. So babies are social. They're observing their adults around them and using those behaviors. Okay, functions of object play and object use. Finding the functions of play are, very elusive. And again, not very encouraging if you look at Paul Martin and Tim Cairo and Sharp and Clutton-Brock. Often predicated on a relatively small time-energy budget. An assumption is that kids spend lots of time and energy engaged in play. In fact, we don't know that. Again, because we have very few naturalistic studies documenting time and energy of kids' play. Where we have studies of kids' time and energy in play, it's about 5% of their energy and time budget. Very, very similar, I might add, to Robert Fagan wrote, I think, to my mind, the most important work in the study of play called Animal Play Behavior. And it's a masterful synthesis of the play literature in posing, many careers could be made on testing the hypotheses that Fagan generated. In his comparison of many, many animal species, he comes up with this very similar figure, about 5% time-energy budget. So not massive. In the developmental literature, what we tend to do is we tend to train kids to play, which, according to my definition, is kind of an iffy assumption. And we assess the degree to which they can use the objects that they played with to either solve a problem or to be creative with. So this is some of what we used in my lab, University of Minnesota. So these are this was attached to this in one condition, the tool use condition. So it was a hoe and a rake. These are tinker toys so when we had kids use toys, these were connected. When we had kids make tools, we gave them these disassembled tinker toys and say, okay, kid, use these, sit at one end of the table. We had a toy at the other end of the table. This is based on the Silva Brunner studies, based on Wolfgang Köhler's studies. And say, okay, kid, don't get out of your seat. Use these things to get the toy. Probably, again, based on Wolfgang Köhler's study of chimpanzees, you hang, Psychology 101, you hang the bananas from the ceiling, give the Sultan, I think was the chimp's name, give Sultan these toys to get the bananas. Couldn't do it. Tried throwing them up. Then I think Sultan probably just gave up and started playing with the objects. Voila! Found out that these objects went together, got the bananas down. Kathy Silva, her doctoral dissertation at Harvard, before she came to Britain with Jerry Brunner, was giving kids an experience either playing with an object or watching someone else use these objects being put together to retrieve, very similar to the things I showed you, using them to retrieve a lure. Open a box and get a treat out of the box. These sessions generally lasted about 10 minutes. And she found, relative to others, kids were more systematic in their problem solving. And they were using information and hints from failures more effectively. Famous study. You'd like to have the citation index that this article has. Funny thing about this article, about this study, it does not replicate. Brian Vandenberg tried to replicate it in 1980, couldn't replicate it. Tony Simon's PhD thesis with Peter Smith couldn't replicate it. The problem was experimenter bias. So experimenters knew what conditions kids were in, the testers of the kids knew what conditions in, they do not replicate. The really sad fact, I think, and I'm really sounding like a Scrooge here, I know, but in current developmental psychology texts, they still cite Silva et al. As being a benefit of play. And at least for how many years? Almost 40 years, they don't replicate. Play ethos, Peter Smith called it. Creativity, again, famous studies, Dansky and Silverman. You give kids toys to play with, saying, okay, kid, you can play with this, or other condition would be imitate what the adult does. The outcome measure would be ask the kid for creative uses of these objects. One experiment, they asked kids to give creative uses for the objects they actually played with. In a second study, the 75 study, I think, 75? Yeah, it's a 75. It was a transfer study. They asked kids for creative uses of an object they didn't play with. Again, cited all over the place, don't replicate. Again, Peter Smith, the great bubble burster, Smith and Whitney, couldn't replicate it. Again, experimenter bias. So when you use double-blind procedures, these things don't replicate. Problem is, you can't expect to change kids' behavior with a 10-minute session. That's part of the problem. Of course, I'm here to provide the answers to you. My idea here is rather than using a 10-minute training session, I gave you this idea of behavioral ecological theory, that there should be a correspondence between the time energy spent in an activity and its payoff. So what we did is we spent time observing kids across a school year with 2 separate studies and looked at kids' uses of objects. So again, there should be a correspondence between time budgets and the activities. First study, relatively small sample, 35 kids, University of Minnesota lab. We coded exploration, object play, tool use, and tool making. And we had a measure of, again, trying to replicate Dansky and Silverman, associative fluency. And we had this lure retrieval where we used the rakes. Okay, so one was selecting a tool, and the other one was actually making a tool using those Tinker Toys. Okay, here it is, the making of the tool. Task 2 was this, and this was very, very, very difficult for kids to use. So we used as an outcome measure whether they did it, again, being good Vygotskians, we used the idea of a zone of proximal development, how much support the kids need to solve the problem. So the more support they needed, the lower score they got. So time, a number of hints, and the number of swipes. Lots of correlations, but when you statistically controlled spatial IQ, very, very few significant correlations between what kids did with these forms, with these objects, and outcomes. I couldn't get this one published in a journal because there were null results. It's in a book chapter. Why so few effects? It could be what Peter Smith said or what Martin and Cairo said. It's not important. You had the word epiphenomenon up there, Jenny. A lot of people say play is epiphenomenal. Or these tool-making tasks are the wrong thing to be assessing. Maybe it's something associated with novelty. And again, if you look at university lab schools, I know in the UK, certainly in the United States, what's valued in university preschools is cooperation and creativity. So kids who want to get social status exhibit these qualities. In many societies, agonistic behavior is how you get status. Agonistic behavior basically is a form of aggression. But in university preschools, agonistic behavior is very costly. By costly, I mean you're going to get punished by the teacher or your peers. By your peers, they're going to ostracize you. Kids who are aggressive are rejected by their peers. Okay, social context for these novel and creative uses of play and creativity were basically ignored in the play literature, except for Pat Bateson. He was early on to this. It's creativity and social behavior that's important. So the idea here is we developed this phenomenon called the seeding hypothesis. That is, when the seeding hypothesis is that creativity is important in a social group because it teaches members of the group how to use objects in a novel and creative way, and this can be useful. And the way you assess this is by looking, to assess its value, is by looking at this, what I called earlier attention structure. The number of kids who are looking at the individual while they're engaged in creative, playful creative object play. I'll tell you how we define that later, how we defined it. Again, it's been used with chimpanzees. People like Brian Vaughan and Everett Waters have used it with preschool kids. And some anthropologists call this the prestige bias. So kids who are high status get looked at. Individuals who are high status get looked at. Again, it's a study I did with a graduate student, 92 kids across the school year. We observed these kids once a week across the school year. Again, we coded exploration, play, construction, and tool use. We didn't code tool making because it was virtually non-existent. And for each of these, we had a novelty and variety score. Okay, a few numbers here. The important number here is attention structure. Here. So this is kids being attended to. Novelty was the only thing. Novelty, variety of object, while they were playing with an object, was the only thing that was correlated with it. So tool use was negatively correlated with play, negatively correlated with exploration, negatively correlated with construction, positively correlated, so kids' play behavior was positively correlated with novelty. Seeing all these correlations, they don't make sense. We correlate anything with anything. I have regressions later to soothe the skeptic in you. Okay, only object play, not other forms of object use significantly predicted novelty. By way of discriminant validity, exploration, a convergent activity, was negatively and significantly correlated with novelty. So novelty is where you're doing diverse things, where you're doing something very specific, you're not being creative. That's clear enough. Okay, so what we were looking at is the degree to which individual kids creative play, object play, predicted their subsequent social attention. Okay, so to what degree, this is the seeding hypothesis, to what degree does being creative and novel with an object predict your social status? Okay, these are hierarchical regressions. In other words, we force these variables in first. So attention structure during the first 3 months. So to control for the autocorrelation between attention 1, attention at time 1, and attention at time 2. In other words, you could be a very popular kid or a kid who evokes a lot of attention, and that could be stable across time. So what you want to do is you want to control that autocorrelation. You only want to look at the effect of the object play. We also looked at, and those were correlated, as you can see. So you might say, well, this is a dimension of temperament or sociability. Okay, we also statistically control previous play from, by previous I meant in the first 3 months. And then we looked at the outcome measures were basically in the last quarter of the year. And as you can see, only novelty predicted social attention. So at some level, the hypothesis is that novelty with objects, creativity with objects predicts social status was supported here. This is the first study to my knowledge. It looked at this. It certainly needs replication. But my idea is researchers have been off the market looking at for social functions of object use, object play. They're looking at the curler type studies and the associative fluency type studies. They've ignored social behavior. Yeah, it may be that the function of object play is to provide models to peers. Paying attention to these individuals benefits the group and the individuals. How am I doing for time? Overtime? Okay, so I won't go into all the other stuff then. Let me jump to the end. Fagan has some interesting counterclaims to this, but that's another story. Okay, talked about this. Induction and deduction are crucial. Psychology needs to get with the program with this. Object use categories are distinct. Okay, and this is my homily at the end, so we could bow our heads. Not everything kids do is play. Oftentimes, you read the fine print, the way ethologists define things categorically, say definition by context. So if you're a juvenile, what you're doing is play. Not everything kids do is play. Keep close to the data. Beware of Peter Smith's play ethos. And you remember Gresham's law of wages, of money. So I think it was Sir William Gresham. The bad money drives out the good money. The bad data drive out the good data. We have good things to say about play, but if we oversell it, people are going to say, oh, well, this is the same old story. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. As I expected, informative and extremely thought-provoking talk. I'm sure your heads are full of lots of questions, but sadly we're out of time. Anthony will be here for the next 10-15 minutes or so before we need to go. If you're bursting to ask questions, please do. We'll let people go who need to leave. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it interesting and provocative. And we look forward to seeing you at the next panel research seminar, hopefully sometime later.